All right, so short reviews for February 23rd includes a pretty solid mix of early uh, March releases, um, and I admittedly didn't spend as much time with everything this week because I've been playing Atomic Heart. I just wanted to play a video game, and it's been fun. So, uh, still gave most of these a fair amount of time. I had to cut a couple of extra things I wanted to include, and yeah, we'll get there. So up front, obviously the big release of March 3rd is Enslaved's Heimdall. It is their 16th full-length album, and this Norwegian band has gone from being one of the earlier examples of Viking black metal to like one of the better examples of an influential progressive black metal band. And now they are, well, now that we're about 20 years beyond that moment and 30 years beyond that moment, they've frankly they've stagnated in a lot of ways. I think that since 2015, I think End Times was the last record that had a big song, a big moment, and the last three have just been all right. They have that sort of um, black metal escalator feeling that you get from the last couple of Enslaved albums. That is their bread and butter now. It's kind of their what they're good at, and otherwise I'm not sure who this is for, and I'm not sure if it is tuneful enough, or maybe I just haven't seen them live in a while to get what these songs are doing. But it just seems like a porridge of many things spilling over, and sometimes it really works. Like Forest Dweller works quite well here. Kingdom is pretty strong, and the closer Heimdall is kind of cool. It's different for the band, and it brings together all the best elements of the record. But there's a lot that leads up to that that is just kind of a little bit of everything, a little bit scratchy. There's the one of the early songs on here, Congelia. It's grating. It's like 9 minutes long, and it just keeps going. And uh, I don't know. It's an interesting start to the month in terms of really wrapping my head around this album, and then remembering that like a couple years ago, I did the same thing with Utgard. I didn't get that record all that much either, but I ended up still enjoying myself. There's still something there. And if you like progressive metal, especially Norwegian progressive metal, and you like progressive black metal, especially Norwegian black metal, you'll understand this language. I just don't know that it says anything to me, you know? So, uh, yeah, check it out yourself. I think that there's so much, there's 30 years of history there, and they put out albums so consistently that it's hard to see the forest for the trees a lot with this band. All right, so I've followed both Full of Hell and Primitive Man since their beginnings. I was definitely just as active back in the early 2010s as I am now in terms of new releases, and I really liked Full of Hell's power take on power violence. They were an aggressive, over-the-top young band, and Primitive Man, likewise, one of the more extreme feeling sludge doom metal bands to kind of come out of nowhere back about 10 years ago, 2013 or so, with Caustic, right? Their first album. I was one of the few people who were kind of touting that album in my little circle back then. So, I was pretty interested to hear what these two bands could do together. But then I remembered everything changed for both of these bands around 2017. Now, what I mean is they sort of branded, they sort of found something new to do that was a little bit more accessible, where they were, they're on the bigger label, they're touring more, and they're looking for things to make themselves both mass appealing, more appealing to the masses, but also do something different and experimental to sort of gain that. And what that meant was experimenting with noise. Now, I'm not an expert on noise, but this was kind of where both bands began to release quite, you know, doing a lot with that without saying very much. So I fell off of both bands, at least in the last 4 or 5 years in terms of interest. Um, so I was happy to come back and see what they were both doing together on this record. And, well, wh- what reference do I have that makes this work for me? Uh, well, the first couple of songs and the final song on the album really pull in a little bit of a early Neurosis kind of experiment where there is the simple sludge rhythm. There is some a cycling lead guitar. There's a lot of layers of noise and all of that clashing together with a lot of over the top screaming does end up sounding like when sludge was at its most avant-garde and interesting back in the 90s, in the late 90s, when there were a few bands doing that kind of thing. Uh, but this album has a lot of moments that I would consider just okay, just kind of filling space. And as much as I like the cacophony of the final track, which is quite long, um, I didn't feel like Full of Hell really comes across on this record based on the tons of their stuff that I've heard outside of about 26 seconds of Bludgeon. Otherwise, I hear a lot of Primitive Man on this record when it comes to actual rhythms, actual hitting the guitar, and what they do. I'm not like making fun of the band at all. I totally respect what they do, but they do just kind of do a thing. Hit a chord, scream a certain way, hit the guitar feedback, and we get that, you know, in a couple of cycles on each of these songs. And after I'd sat there with it 3 or 4 times, I was like, well, I mean, it got me there in terms of the feeling. It got me somewhere, but there was a lot of just kind of sitting there while, um, the 6 minute dark ambient track plays in the middle of the record. Um, just as the action seems to be picking up beyond the first three songs, and it never goes anywhere because that last song is just the last song doesn't really work. So I couldn't recommend this one because it just didn't. I didn't feel like there was anything added to either band. I didn't feel like there was like, uh, if when you come out of it, there's been some great collaborative split albums or just collaborative albums in the last 10 years. And the best ones you come out of it thinking, damn, I want to hear another one of those. I want them to do it again. I can't wait for part two. In this case, I don't think that this yielded anything that I'd want to hear again, or they'd need to refine it considerably to include a little bit more of each personality. So, a little bit overbearing on my part, but I wanted to explain myself. Verminoth is a Pennsylvania-based, I think York, Pennsylvania, somewhere like that, death metal quintet, and their style is a mix of groovier, simple rhythms and sort of a slamming brutal death sound. That doesn't mean that this is slam and that this is mosh metal or anything like that. I mean that the production values lean into a more digital sounding kind of deathcore drum sound, and the guitars otherwise play simple, standard grooves that have sort of a crawling doom to them. It's a cool place to go with this band. I think their first record was more of a pinging kind of brutal death metal influenced, uh, almost maybe more old school leaning with the sound. This feels a little bit more modern. It's a more interesting sound overall, but I don't think the guitars really sold me on this one. But yeah, check out the EP and see where you land with it. It's cool. I just don't think it's there with the songs 100%. Witch Throat Throat Serpent is a French psychedelic doom metal band, very much in the spirit of Electric Wizard, and definitely they're sort of mid to late 2000s era, sort of the classic era of that band. But this is a less obscured. It is a modern production. It is very much a lineage beyond that, and it features a lot of musicians who played in some extreme metal bands as well. So it wouldn't seem like there's that much to say about a record like this, but it is their, I think, fourth record, and they've gotten a lot better at uh, changing up the texture of maybe the guitar tone or switching up the style of the vocals a little bit. The cadence is a little bit aimless sometimes. It's a little bit gloomy most of the time. So I like this kind of thing. I like to see those variations on the stoner fuzz doom sound and see where different bands take it in terms of polish. So this is a pretty polished example, and I think the kind of thing I like to pick up and just enjoy for an evening every once in a while. And this is a pretty good example. I think I liked some of the uh, more adventurous stuff on the last record, but this was more consistent, just kind of more of a straightforward thing from Witch Throat Serpent, and I'm glad to see they're still going at it. So check that out.
Evil in this every room of this cursed house.
Witch Ripper is a Seattle, Washington area stoner metal, alternative rock kind of prog thing. And it's not that weird when you sit with it. Basically, what they've done on this record is take a lot of influences from operatic, kind of arena rock music, and applied it just a little bit of their previous sound, which was Mastodon-esque in terms of a progressive sludge rock kind of sound with more involved riff style. So the way that I framed this is that there's a couple of songs that sound like Muse, and there's a couple of songs that sound like Howling Giant. So if you like those bands, I think this is going to be a really great pickup because it's uh, not necessarily catchy, but it's operatic. It's some good action for a live performance or a narrative if you like narrative, and uh, there's a kind of a Bowie-esque track at the end. You could tell that you could tell where they're coming from, and to apply that to just a little hint of like the Baroness slash Mastodon kind of sound that you'll know from the 2000s. Um, I thought that was pretty cool. It's not really my thing overall. That's why the recommendation is not particularly high. But I could see this is a big transformation for the band. You could see that they put a lot into it, and that these songs are pretty much watertight in terms of the interest they generate. And they do balance out a lot of their more aggressive side with uh, songwriting. So if you're looking for riffs, you're not going to find them on too many of these songs in terms of really digging into it. So yeah, they don't sound like early Mastodon anymore if you're looking for that. So yeah. Terveet Cadet is a Finnish, pretty classic Finnish hardcore punk band who started in the early 80s. And this is the kind of band you should know. You should know Anti-Cimex, you should know Totalitar, and you should know Terveet Cadet because they brought a lot of that early street punk energy to Scandinavian hardcore and hardcore punk in a very important way in the early 80s. Now they've been a lot of places and done a lot of things since then. I don't know how many members are even from that original lineup, but what you'd want to concern yourself with if you're looking to check out this album is if you've heard the 2015 kind of comeback record from the band, which was also on Spart, and they split up after that album, put out a band with the name of the band was the title of that album, Lapin Helveti, and that was a little bit more of a thrashcore, a crossover feeling, hardcore punk record, and this latest record is very much in that style. I mean, and it's very much my thing. I really enjoy that early to mid 80s hardcore punk sound, and they don't stay entirely regional. They are kind of a classic Scandinavian hardcore punk band, but that scene drew from, all the United States input. It drew from, German influence, a lot of things. So you feel that all over this record. There's 16 songs, 23 minutes, and I've, not all of it is amazing, but most of it's pretty good. And I like how they variously emphasize kind of the bass guitar tone, which is pretty strong throughout the album. And there's a lot of catchier songs that are trying something different towards the end of the running order. So uh, they pack a lot in there, and it feels like an experience. So uh, I enjoyed it quite a bit, and will definitely recommend it. Sorceress is an early band from the two people behind Mismore and Hell. But it this was so Behind the Mountain is a 2009 released full length record that released on CD with like 100 copies, and most people never really heard of it or mentioned it until 2020 when the artist uh, re-released it on CD and digitally. Now, that's a shame that this kind of never got full due outside of just kind of underground stoner doom circles, because it really was a great product of its time, where uh, classic stoner doom metal was really at its peak originality and feeling, because occult doom and occult rock had sort of given it a kick in the ass in the late 2000s. So this is a good example of the feeling of kind of late 70s rock theater, a little bit of a character embodied by the vocalist, and a lot of atmosphere available to stoner doom metal that we don't really get so often. Um, so there's a bit of mastery to this record. It's a really fantastic study on what you could be bringing to your stoner doom metal band if you had uh, just an ear for imagery and aesthetic, in terms of what you can develop with a couple of sound recordings and some unique screeches, and uh, a very psychedelic approach to longer form pieces. I know I'm all over the place, but there's a lot to consider with this record. I do think it is very underrated, and um, really, the first two songs will sell most anybody on this record. If you like stoner doom metal or just doom metal in general, those first couple of songs are enough to sell, I think, most anyone on this thing. But you don't see as many people ever mention the later tracks, such as the title track, which is like 20 minutes long, and it's this whole psychedelic breakdown, and there's a lot going on this record that's worth exploring. So the reason I'm talking about it is because it's being reissued on vinyl, or it was never issued on vinyl before. This is the first time. So I think it's definitely worth getting if you like this type of music, and I think most people would like run out to get it once they've heard those first couple of songs. So definitely a pretty cool thing, and I'm glad that somebody finally gave it the vinyl treatment. Okay, the second album from Ruined Guard is not necessarily more of the same. This is a raw but atmospheric black metal band from a Chilean artist known as Lord Vault Grifftalk, who is in Parificatum and a ton of like 20 different raw black metal bands and different types of 90s influenced black metal ideas, as well as some more obscure noise and dungeon synth projects. Uh, if you're familiar with Mahamvantara Arts Records, which I think it might be his label or part of a collective. You'll understand where this record is coming from in terms of the very lo-fi raw sound and the uh, use of keyboards that are distant but still have that sort of proper 90s feeling in that they change the entire atmosphere of the piece. So I particularly like this kind of thing. It reminds me of listening to old black metal demos, demo tapes, and kind of digging through those. And it just sort of has that appeal where it's mysterious, it's distant. You're kind of craning your neck to hear it a little bit better, and I find it entertaining. Um, if I'm going to recommend a project of this guy's, it'd probably be Pyrrhic. But this is a good one and an interesting record if you're into obscure black metal. So, Spanish heavy metal band Iron Curtain have gone through a fair number of lineup changes over time, and more recently they sort of switched in a new guitarist, recorded a couple of new songs, I think re-recorded or included a different session here. But there are four new songs on Metal Gladiator from this band, and they showcase a more raw, back to the kind of 79 to 82 feeling of new wave of British heavy metal, which has always kind of been their main influence. And it turns its back on the new wave of traditional heavy metal and the softness, the indirect uh, poodle metal of it all, and gets right to heavy metal. Uh, there's a lot of grit to this production value on these new songs. There are more direct guitar lines. Everything has melody, but it's delivered in a gruff way. And I think this is the kind of heavy metal that I like quite a bit. So that's it bodes well if since this is sort of a preview of where they're headed with the album next. I think that's great. I'm actually really interested in where they go. I love this album art. I love the sound of those new songs. But there's also a set of three or four additional pieces from a different recording, which show maybe their more melodic side, and those have guest solos from a bunch of different members of different bands, and I enjoyed those as well. But the main event are the newer songs here for me. So anyway, I liked all of it. It totally justifies a purchase. This was a high recommendation from me, and yeah, it's just this is the type of thing that I'm into.
Welcome to hell! Evil eyes, demonize, take the boat across the land. Seeing us gonna pay, you're gonna burn in hell!
All right, Temptress is a Dallas, Texas-based psychedelic rock trio with a bit of a doom influence, and but not necessarily a traditional one. This is more of a jammed desert rock feeling recording, which starts out with a couple of very long, about 10-minute pieces. It sets an interesting tone. They are putting their best foot forward because they are most interesting at their slowest and most psychedelic. Whenever whenever this record jumps up to sort of a rocking jog pace, it falls apart a little bit. The vocals try to do a little bit too much. The rhythms fall apart, and we get a bit of a strained neck in terms of not being sure how to move to the music at some point. So it's an interesting record. It's an odd record that is very uneven in its pace and style. I think that the best parts, the slower, more psychedelic pieces that develop a certain range of expression, are pretty solid. There's a lot of very good choices made here, but I think there's just a couple of songs on here that just kind of go a little bit batshit, and not in like a frantic way, and just sort of um, they're just pushing too hard, and it's not necessarily working. Um, I think Hopeless was the hardest song because there's so many good elements put into it, but then the vocals just sort of, there's a yelping to the vocals that just doesn't fit the moment and doesn't fit the feeling, and the mood of the song just becomes distempered and strange and as it goes. So this was a moderate recommendation just because I do think that a good chunk of it, between the presentation of the album, and a couple of most of the songs on here, they do kind of get somewhere interesting, and I think they should keep going with that. But there's just a lot of just ends that needed tying up, and things that needed more thought put into them to make it a whole record, to make it a listening experience. Because there's really no hope of this type of music playing well as singles or anything like that. So uh, worth checking out if you're interested in kind of a weirder, doomed psychedelic rock kind of thing.
There's a